My name is Jeremy Stewart. I am a principal and technical director at MASARY Studios.
I'm Odie, DeSmith. I'm the technical manager at MASARY.
MASARY Studios is a transdisciplinary art studio. We create artworks that involve sound, light, video projection, custom software, custom hardware. We do artworks that are short-term up to permanent installations. We do performances. We frequently collaborate with composers, dance companies, and other artists.
Sound sculpture is an interactive light and sound instrument and installation that's comprised of 25 location-aware cubes that are intended to invite community composition and collaboration, as well as evoke universal trends and themes within composition across mediums. So the underlying technology in sound sculpture is really built off of an ultra-wideband location system that tracks objects in space using transmitters and receivers. That data is then interpreted on a dedicated CPU that takes all that location data and spits it over an MQTT stream into our back-end software, in this case Touch Designer, where that data is processed, formatted, and turned into OSC messages and MIDI data that are piped into Max. The tools in Max are actually existing in Max for Live so that they can live natively in Ableton sessions where we do all this sort of creative composition for the piece in much the same way that you would with VSTs or any sort of live performance set that someone might do in session mode with Live. The difference here that you can also edit lighting events per scene, different scaling of the incoming MIDI notes, and anything that is a parameter in our system can be edited directly through automation in Ableton, which gives us a lot of flexibility when we're writing for the piece. So that's really what's at the core of our use for Max in that project, is using Max for Live to make quick edits to those, much in the same way that you would compose any sort of live performance using Ableton.
The project Phase Garden really focuses on using the natural time cycles of our cosmic neighborhood as the source for musical and light-based composition. The core question for Phase Garden that we started with was, what would it mean to compose with the cycles of the cosmos at some scale? In the first iteration, we really focused on what are the cycles of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun. And then the second iteration this past year, we looked at the rotations of all of the planets, both the day length and the year length of all of those. And what I mean when I say the time periods of those rotations is treating those rotations literally as like a ramp signal that goes from 0 to 1 over some period of time. So in the case of Earth, it would take 364 or 5 days to go from 0 to 1, and just as a simple ramp signal. And same with the day period being 24 hours. But extrapolating that out to be every planet in the solar system, and then we can interpret those ramp signals not just as ramps, but we can interpret them as sine waves. And then we might combine those sine waves through addition or multiplication or division to produce more complex wave forms. The presentation of the artwork is 12 10-foot tall truss towers, each equipped with 7 light fixtures and speakers on each, in a circle, in a huge circle that's 110 feet in diameter. And standing in the center of this artwork, you have the experience of these events slowly circling around you and periodically sounding in accordance to the coincidental happenings of the solar system. The first iteration of Max used Python as the backend, and from there we were actually talking to that backend via OSC coming from Touch Designer, acting as a GUI. So we would open up this Touch Designer GUI and say, I want such and such a signal combined with such and such a signal, add it, and then that would send an OSC message to our Python backend, which would then create that new signal. And then as that signal's running, it's sending out messages about the value of that signal and when there are any zero crossings, kind of as a continuous stream over OSC to Max. And in the new version, iteration 2 this past year, we kind of did away with all of that Python backend and recreated it all in Max, so that now we have user interface and all of the signal generation that runs the whole piece in one place, so we can control how we want to combine different signals and what compositional signals we're working with and where those messages get sent, all within Max. And then it will send note events both to Touch Designer over OSC, that then Touch Designer translates those into DMX with the proper universe and addressing and outputs them to our DMX interfaces. And then Max will also generate MIDI events simultaneously with that and send those MIDI events out to Ableton, where it'll generate our sound.
A big push that we had to bring everything into one sort of standalone software was the flexibility of the output of that. And it could send MIDI events into Ableton to trigger different sounds as we've traditionally done, or you could hook it up to a hardware synthesizer or any other kind of tool and treat it more as a general phase-based complex sequencer. So that kind of plays back into some of the work we did with Sound Sculpture, is that this thing is really just a tool and an instrument for us to express things with, and it can then pipe that to many different formats, mediums, and sound scores. I think that idea of phase-based composition is something that interests both myself and one of our principal founders, Ryan Edwards, very much. We both love Brian Eno, Music for Airports, all those ideas of how you can create complexity from simple repeating events as long as they're like developed and played back asynchronously. So we were really excited by sort of the natural rhythms that exist in the universe and applying that same compositional technique to that.
Recursion and Release is a audio video performance installation that features a 5-person vocal ensemble, as well as real-time audio analysis of all of those ensemble members discreetly. It features in a separate space, in a second location, real-time video projection that is projection mapped to one of the interior facades and the ceiling of the site. That video is procedurally generated based on the audio analysis of the ensemble. Also in that second location, we're doing real-time audio manipulation using Max. Each of the ensemble members has a close microphone that is on a stand directly in front of them. So there's 5 microphone inputs, and those 5 inputs then get fed into our audio interface, where it goes to 2 different locations, the dry signal. First, that dry signal gets passed into our audio manipulation software that's all running in Max MSP, and that's where we have a bunch of VSTs running and custom effects running kind of on this giant matrix setup where we can mix together different routes of inputs and outputs between these various effects. And the output from that, all of this kind of manipulated, wet, gooey sound that comes out of this process, out of Max, we built a custom audio analysis platform that's running on a dedicated server sitting next to us. And that dedicated server takes in both the dry signal and the manipulated wet signal. So it's analyzing 10 channels of audio simultaneously. And for each frame, it's producing 40 plus analysis outputs. So it's producing a lot of data, and this is all spectral data and data about kind of note onsets and pitch content and sound quality, et cetera, et cetera. All of that analysis data then feeds back into the software that we have running in Max, where then within Max we can say, listen for the spectral flux of the performer's voice and attach that to the way that our reverb gets routed to our delay line. And we'll do this across all of the performers. But since each performer is performing a very different part and has very different vocal qualities and all of that, it means that each one of these performers, the sound of their voice is being manipulated in very dynamic ways that's different from each other, which is a pretty cool way to work. It's kind of like meta composing the effects, where we're setting up conditions rather than manually mixing together different effects.
I think since we're passing around so many different audio signals in this process between different computers, analysis machines, things that are controlling lighting. It's definitely one of our more ambitious audio setups that we've attempted at the studio, and I think we were really happy with how it came together in the end and everything that was possible within that system.
My deep background was as a jazz musician. I did my undergrad in jazz composition at Berklee College of Music. And then after undergrad, I ended up at Bennington College working as an intern for a couple years. And during my time there, I was introduced to Max as a tool, and I started collaborating with dancers. After leaving Bennington, I did my MFA and my PhD at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in their electronic arts program. While I was still doing my MFA at RPI, I started working with the founding members of MASARY Studios and kind of became more and more a part of the studio. And I've been a part of the studio ever since. That's 7 years ago.
Yeah, I've sort of always had music in my life for one way or another. I came up as a rock and roll guitar player kid and started recording my own music around high school and getting into the technology. It was around that period where it was just as affordable to grab an audio interface and set up in a garage as it was to go into a professional recording studio. That led me to my undergrad at California Institute of the Arts, studying music technology and interaction design. And there I sort of started getting more interested in interactive artworks, generative music, and different systems for creating compositions outside of the normal linear structure of things and using multimedia tools. After I graduated, I linked up with some of the folks at MASARY, and we had a lot of shared interests around instrument building, interactive art, multimedia works, and the rest is history here. Yeah, I think as a technical team and technical department, we're really excited by emerging technologies and doing things that are novel and haven't been done previously. And it can be interesting to work with the other team members in our group to find where those balance and fit conceptually with what we're trying to express in the artwork.
But ultimately then we'll at some point say, what's the reason this is happening? What's the reason that we're putting this together in this way? What's the message or what's the story that is supposed to be presented to the world? And is all this other stuff that we're using to do that really getting us as close to that in its best form as possible? The gut check has always been for me, like, does this feel like a tech demo to me? Or is it like, that's like the worst, in my opinion. Like if we make something and it comes off as a tech demo, that's the worst outcome. And the best outcome is like all of the tools and the technology and whatever just kind of dissolves into the background and it doesn't really matter to the average person.
I think that expanding on Max and bringing it into other dimensions for me was all about first understanding what was really effective about Max and things that only it can do in ways that I'm comfortable and familiar with. A lot of that being principles that I take out of synthesis and my own practice with music and applying those to other kinds of data structures, whether that's using ramps, complex combinations of LFOs, different signal generators to drive lighting events in a different program over some kind of network protocol, or just finding that familiarity with the things that you're comfortable about and passionate about, and then using that as a jumping off point to apply it to different mediums, to other kinds of softwares, and using what those softwares do well to produce different kinds of results. But kind of starting all that exploration in something that you already have a degree of comfort in and familiarity with is a really powerful thing.
I mean, I would also add my experience way back when I started using Max, and Max was definitely the first software, like before I learned how to program or write any code or anything like that, Max was my first introduction to kind of this world of creating interactive art things. And when I started trying to learn more text-based programming languages, I realized that having used Max for a number of years, I actually already had a lot of knowledge from using Max. So it was easier to start digging into things like Python. But then also using Python and learning to use Python and learning to use a programming language like that also has definitely fed back into the way that I use something like Max. It's both a good jumping off point to lead into other tools and technologies and approaches and programming languages, but it's also something that like we still consistently use it for, many projects, and it consistently remains, the best tool for the job in a lot of cases.